EdTech Live is sponsored by K12computers.com, where you can save up to 50% on factory refurbished Dell Optiplex computers, and by TechnologyRescue.com, helping schools reuse existing computer hardware to build state-of-the-art Linux thin client labs at a fraction of the cost of traditional computing. This is Steve Hargadon, and it's Thursday, September 7th, 2006. This evening my guest is Dr. Larry Cuban, Emeritus Professor of Education at Stanford University. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you, Steve.
I'm glad to have you on. I have a confession to make. I have not read your book, and I would normally not like to hold the interview without reading your book, but it was there used to be a link for it at the Harvard site in a PDF format, and that since has disappeared. And I later found an archived copy, but not in time to actually go through it.
You'll live.
Well, I have read several articles that seem to be focused on there were interviews with you that seem to be focused on the same themes and topics.
Okay.
And if so, and I hope you'll let me know where I've not fully understood the message. But I thought I'd tell a quick story at the beginning to get us started. A couple of years ago, I was invited by KinderCare to come up to their corporate offices to talk about their computer systems. And they were experiencing a problem with their computers. They were using an Apple computer, a Macintosh computer, and the kids at the preschool facilities were actually breaking the CD-ROM drives in the computers by poking things into them. And they asked me if I knew of a comparable IBM-based system that would be, simple and an all-in-one machine. And we got to talking about it, and I realized that they were probably excellent candidates for some very good alternative technologies that would provide educational computing resources, but at a lot less cost. And I kind of pitched that to them, and they said, "Oh, you've clearly not understood what's going on here. This is really more about the parents' perception and expectation that we have computers than it is about actually using them. We wouldn't have them unless the parents were expecting, when they came in to consider coming to our facilities, that there needed to be computers there." So I get the sense that may be going on at all grade levels.
The fact that parents want schools to be modern, the fact that parents expect schools to prepare their kids for not only the contemporary labor market, but for the future labor market, are part of those kinds of things that would drive a private entrepreneur like KinderCare to have those computers. Yeah, I think that's part of the picture, but of course that's nothing new. Parents have always had expectations about what schools ought to do for their children because of parents' investment in their kids, the belief that schools are social escalators to a better life, and on and on and on. So that's part of a much larger picture about the purposes of schooling in a democracy.
Well, one of the things that I kept hearing or seemed to hear in the different interviews that I read with you was that in some ways the driving factors associated with putting computers into schools aren't necessarily the ones that would produce the best results. So, parental concerns about having computers in schools, or political discussions about American children falling behind, those concerns and drivers don't necessarily produce an environment in which teachers will naturally and effectively use computers in the classroom.
I think that's largely accurate. But remember, the computers are only the most recent incarnation of electronic technologies in classrooms. I mean, the very first, if you think about the film, and then radio, and then instructional television, there's a history here to innovations that are machine innovation. So when we talk about computers, we have to keep that in mind, because computers are simply the most recent to come off the assembly line for schools to use as ways to transform teaching and learning, to make kids and teachers more productive, and particularly for computers, to prepare them for the labor market, so that all kids, when they graduate, will have those necessary keyboard skills and spreadsheet skills and so on. So those are generally the reasons, and they tend to be external to what happens in a classroom when a teacher is facing 25 students, or at the high school level, 150 students a day. So the fact that you have these expectations of what these miracle machines are going to do, to teachers, many of them, but not all of them, see this as an addition to all the other expectations that they have to meet, ranging from standards for a curriculum to the current test to making sure that the kids are respectful and mannerly in schools. So you have this kind of a hyped up kind of expectations of what computers can do in schools.
Well, and I certainly didn't hear you saying that there aren't oftentimes, good statistics showing that in certain circumstances computers really do effectively help in a learning process. But I think what I heard you saying was that that we are potentially putting teachers in a role where we blame them for not implementing technology, when in fact we've put them in a situation where not only are they consumed by the other expectations that they have, but if they only have a few computers that aren't really reliable, it's not fair to expect them to kind of turn everything upside down to work just with those computers.
In part I am saying that. I think that's fair to say. Where all of this comes into very clear focus in September of 2006 is all the hype about one-to-one laptops. Here again, you have these high expectations of one-to-one, in this case, transforming teaching and learning. You'll have, instead of more teacher-centered, you'll have more student-centered kind of teaching. Kids are going to learn on their own. They have access to Google. The world is now at their fingertips. And then, obviously, if every kid has a laptop, they are going to be prepared for the labor market. And, of course, they're going to be more productive in everything they do. So those historic kinds of expectations of what these machines can do come almost like laser-like in a focus beam now when we talk about one-to-one computing. And where that one-to-one computing is very engaging, and there's no question that a lot of kids and a lot of teachers are thoroughly entranced by it and like it, and it works well for certain portions of it. But that it's going to do all of these things that the expectations hold, I just don't see any evidence for it in the past. And although there are very few studies done now of one-to-one laptops, I'm skeptical.
So I think your perspective is really an important one and really worth focusing on just a little here. Would you describe the historical perspective that you're bringing to the use of technology in the classrooms and some of the examples of where technology has been adopted by teachers and has helped them be more efficient, and examples where it has not actually been adopted?
Sure. Let's take pieces of that, and you may have to remind me in effect, I hear you asking three things. The historical thing is that computers in schools is simply the most recent of a number of reforms that have been aimed at teachers over the past century. And so when I look at new reading programs, phonics in the classroom, when I look at cooperative learning, computers is a piece of all that, because these are reforms that are usually decisions are made about these reforms by administrators and policymakers for teachers, and then they're handed over to teachers to implement. And so when teachers don't when teachers don't necessarily implement them smoothly or completely, then teachers are often blamed. There's a long history to that. Computers is simply the most recent incident of that long history. Now, have teachers initially in the early 1980s, when the first desktop computers were available, teachers were called technophobes and so on like that. And that was really an unfair characterization of teachers, because a lot of vendors would make those descriptions because teachers weren't immediately using these wonderful machines. What I have found in my own research, and what others have also found, is that teachers by and large, certainly now in the year 2006, and when I was doing my research around the year 2000, teachers by and large had computers at home, and were using computers at home for many things, including lesson plans, contacts with parents, and everything, but they were not using them as much in school for instruction. In school, they were using them for administrative purposes like grade books and so on. But beyond that, for classroom use, they weren't using them as much, and nor were students. Most of the students that we studied had computers at home, and they were using it more at home for games, for homework, for writing, that kind of things, and much less so in school. So you have this kind of paradox where people who really want to use computers at home are simply not using it as much in school, and then you begin to ask the questions, why is that? We're not talking about technophobia on the part of adults by and large. What we're talking about is the nature of schooling, the many purposes that schools are supposed to serve in a democracy, and that teachers have to finesse all of these different purposes, all within the context of a classroom over a period of 5 to 6 hours of teaching. And that becomes difficult, particularly if you don't have a sufficient number of computers. But even if you do have a sufficient number of computers, teaching and learning in a school is more than simply getting ready for tests. Is more than doing the best you can on the curriculum standards and worrying about those things. Teaching and learning is also about socialization, civic learning, learning how to get along with other people. There's a whole lot of things that schools are expected to do beyond simply tapping on a keyboard. So it's because of these kinds of external expectations that you get that everyone seems to think that all schools are about is simply having teachers use a computer so that you can have better forms of teaching and learning, more productive, but that doesn't capture what tax-supported public schools are supposed to do in this kind of a society. Now, I may have missed some things, Steve, so you follow up and ask me.
No, I think you did a very good job, and that's exactly what I was hoping that you would begin to discuss.
I know. You would ask about, I estimate that there is about 10% of K-12 teachers who use computers for instruction regularly. And I would say that means regularly for me means at least once a week and up to daily. I mean, and that 10% are the early adopters, the people who see the potential of the kind of learning that can occur with computers. There's another 30 to 40, perhaps to 50% that use computers occasionally. Everything from mobile carts to computer labs, different kinds of disciplines at the secondary level, like English, would probably use them a little more. But that's occasionally, and that could be maybe once every few weeks, once a month. And then there's a whole bunch of teachers, upwards of half to less, depending, about half of the teachers, who hardly use it at all. And will use other kinds of technology like overhead projectors, video cassettes, and so on, but tend not to use the computers. because a lot of them just are overloaded, and even if they use them at home, just don't seem to find the kinds of lessons and units that they can easily integrate the use of these machines. So there are teachers who I've been most impressed with and I have seen at work in many, many schools. And there are, of course, high-tech high schools and magnet schools that are based on technology where you see wonderful things occurring because these are where kids and teachers volunteer to work at. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, no, you've touched on everything that I was hoping you would. The overhead projector for me, combined with your statistic about helping us understand that these teachers aren't technophobes. I mean, they're using the computers at home. It kind of opened my eyes to the realization that if a computer were simple to implement as an overhead projector, then of course it would be being used. Meaning, if you could integrate a computer as easily into all of the other things that a teacher is being asked to do, then naturally that would occur. It's not that the teachers, are not interested in technology and are not capable of making transformations. It's just that the computer, for most of them at this point, isn't as easy as just bringing in an overhead projector.
It certainly isn't. What the computer is it's a powerful interactive tool. And the interactivity makes it quite different than the overhead projector and makes it more complex to integrate into the classroom. A small percentage of teachers do it wonderfully. What I often point out, and it doesn't seem to catch with people, is that if you look at the places that have the most access to computers and use drops off in the classroom, because that's what I'm talking about. There's a big gap between access and use. Simply, if you give access to everyone to computers like one-to-one laptops, that doesn't mean they all use them all the time. The place where that exists, that wonderful, abundant access, is a university. Every student, every professor has at least one, sometimes 2, 3, 4 computers at their fingertips, at home, in the office, and so on. When you go into university classrooms again, you still see, surprisingly, less than 10% of the professoriate ever use those computers instructionally. Often those who do use it would use PowerPoint presentations and so on. Yet most professors do not integrate the use of computers into their instruction, just like you don't have most people doing that at K-12, and yet access is abundant. It's on a one-to-one basis at the university, and a lot of K-12 champions of laptops want that to happen there. The point I'm making, of course, is that when you have the abundant access, it doesn't guarantee regularity in use, and certainly there's no guarantee that regularity in use will produce the desired outcomes.
And I really appreciated that perspective from you as well, which is, what are we really trying to accomplish? And in one of the articles, you make the point that, we may look at the amount of money that we would spend on computers that we think are going to provide some kind of a bump or aid to student achievement, and determine that, in fact, we could spend less than that on additional teachers' aides or other kinds of traditional supports that would actually have more of an impact than the computers would for the same dollar amount.
Yes, that is correct. And the reason I can say that is that it's very, very difficult to have any kind of study or series of studies that show that the use of computers increases academic achievement. And there are a number of good reasons why it's hard to show that. But it's that lack of causal relationship between using computers and producing higher achievement that is the weakest link in all of the rationale to get computers into K-12 education. And that's really unfortunate, which is why, if there's this lack of evidence for this, why not pursue alternative ways of using money? Because computers in schools is a very substantial investment, because it's not only computers, the hardware, the software, the wiring. That's only part of the cost. The professional development, the concept of total cost of operation over a period of time means that you ought to begin looking at how else could we use that kind of money over a 5-year period, that where there is some evidence that alternative ways of using those funds might produce the increased academic achievement.
What's interesting about your message to me is that it's nuanced, which is, you say, I mean, the title of the book, Oversold and Underused. You know, what I hear you saying is not that computers don't have a place or that they cannot provide help academically in some circumstances, but we haven't been very good at really figuring out where that is, and so there's been, you know, a real push to implement them without thoughtfully saying, okay, this is where they help and this is where they don't.
I would agree with that. Well, that's nice. I wish people had said that 10 years ago when I and a number of other people were saying the same thing, but that doesn't seem to be the case, but I'm glad that you're saying that now.
I've wondered if there is a little bit of the emperor has no clothes story with educational technology, and again, not wanting to not be balanced, but I've looked at the enormous amount of money that's been spent on educational technology, and that gets spent in our local area as well, and then thought about all of the programs that haven't been kept because there were a lack of finances, and I'll go to back to school night, and the first thing they present me with is a piece of paper for additional fundraising for the school.
Right.
And it's a little hard as a parent to not feel like, gosh, have we just been so distracted here that we have poured all of this money into computer technology and not done some other things that were really important?
No, I would agree with you. You remember how you started this interview with that the story about the kindercare?
Right.
What can you imagine a principal and a faculty saying to sixth grade parents or elementary school parents, no, we are not going to have any computers in this school at all. And even we want good teaching, blah, 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 but we are not going to. Well, a lot of those parents, not all, but a lot of those parents would be outraged. They say, what are you talking about? Our kids are facile with technology. They're better than a lot of the teachers. You've got to have computers. The point I'm making, of course, is that the pressures for a school to be up to date, to be innovative, are so strong, particularly in middle income and upper middle income districts and schools, that principals, superintendents, school boards, and teachers are really caught by those kinds of societal pressures as focused in on the parents' demands, so that they bring in the computers. But it's not necessarily integrated into the programs at all. So those you can't ignore when you provide taxation for public schools. You can't avoid those external pressures, and they have to be accommodated politically.
Well, I know that I interviewed Mike Huffman from Indiana a few weeks back, and they're moving forward on a one-to-one computing project that involves Linux. So they're trying to substantially reduce the cost per machine.
Sure.
But be that as it may, they looked at the last 10 years and calculated that they had spent in Indiana $1 billion on educational technology for their K-12 schools.
Wow.
And that the average student was getting 35 minutes a week for that $1 billion. And they thought, there's just something not quite right here.
Yeah.
There's no way that in 35 minutes a week anybody's going to get excited about integrating technology into the curriculum. And here we've spent an enormous amount of money, and of course we're not seeing any real results.
Right. I'm not familiar with that analysis for the state of Indiana, but those are telling facts that you mentioned, and it just raises those kinds of questions. For example, I read recently that a high school in Arizona called Empire Senior High School is 1-to-1, and they're not buying textbooks. Now, this is the kind of innovation that that jiggles all of the important kinds of bells that have to be rung when you talk about embracing electronic innovations. And but my hunch is that at some point, those textbooks are going to show up. Even though superintendents very astutely pointed out that the kids are going to have access to an encyclopedia in the world's libraries, and they don't need textbooks and so on. And he's very nicely brought down the cost of the machines to something that's very reasonable and all that. But parents are going to want textbooks. There's no question about that at some point for different subjects. And teachers are going to want textbooks. And so these kinds of outstanding kinds of innovations that grab headlines in newspapers across the country are further examples of the role that schools play in trying to stay abreast of parental demands for reform and still try to do their job of satisfying the parental demands for socializing their children, for growing their children intellectually. But all of these other kinds of purposes still come into play, which is why I think Empire High School, I would predict, will have textbooks in 5 years.
You know, where I've noticed that the situation is slightly altered in schools is in religious schools. I noticed that when I have worked with Lutheran schools or Catholic schools or Jewish schools, that they typically haven't felt the same pressure to implement technology. And I've imagined and think it may be accurate that, you know, you're not sending your child to a private religious school necessarily because of the computer education. You're sending them there because they're going to learn, you know, whatever subjects within the framework of that religious tradition.
That's a nice point.
You know, they haven't felt the same. It doesn't seem to me they felt the same pressures to implement technology. Although they feel them, but they end up making decisions to put their money in other places.
That's a nice point, and I wish I had thought about that. That's a nice point to make.
I give it to you as a gift.
Thank you very much. Because there's a lot of evidence. Because what is very important at a private school, particularly if it's denominational, is the religious values, the ideology, and the socialization that parents expect these kinds of schools to carry on. And sure, every one of those families are probably going to have a computer at home, and the kids are going to be computer literate very early on and so on. But the school, because of its ideological and value focus, it's much more, it's much less about, geez, we got to get these kids ready for the labor market and all that. It's much more around these other values. That's a good point.
Does it make a difference that kids are coming to school so technology savvy? What's the impact of that on this equation?
Well, let's see. When kids go to school, these technologically savvy kids go to school, I don't think they expect video games in school. I don't think they expect joysticks to use to maneuver around a classroom and all that. That technological savvy, let's call it street smarts around that, has always existed in schools in the sense that the kids are bringing in a different kind of knowledge that is not school knowledge. It's a different kind of knowledge that immigrant kids at the turn of the 20th century were coming to school with a different kind of street knowledge, a different kind of moxie. And schools were not expected to necessarily use that and exploit it, except certain kinds of teachers would try to use it and make it work. So what you have in schools today when kids have all of that savvy is that some teachers will make use of it. Some of those kids end up to be the technological whiz kids in a school. Some of those kids help the teachers. Some of those kids run the computer labs. So it gets used in those what I would call peripheral or marginal ways. But then again, school is not supposed to teach that. When you talk about critical thinking skills, which is one of the areas that schools are supposed to teach, that becomes very important, because if a kid just goes on to Google and can't sort out which sources are better than other sources for a particular question that he or she wants to answer, then schools have to teach those kinds of analytic skills about authors' bias, about the importance of sorting out whether a company that produces an article that looks good has a particular kind of bias and all of that. That's what schools are supposed to do to help kids use their technological facility.
One of the examples that's widely used amongst the educators who are using Web 2.0 or actively trying to integrate the internet into their classrooms is when you do a search for Martin Luther King on Google, and they point out that one of the early sites that pop up, if you don't sort of dig deep into it, is actually run by a white supremacist group.
I didn't know that.
And and this example is used a lot, but they sort of drill down and they say, kids don't, if you're not teaching them the analytical skills to drill past the initial impression, they don't really, they're not going to realize that they're seeing something which is distorted or one person's point of view when they think they're getting something that is maybe more balanced. And so certainly that, I think that is a really good point. And when I grew up, I certainly feel like the liberal arts was a significantly respected academic tradition for those very reasons.
Right.
And now it seems like everybody majors in economics. And I've wondered if we're losing a little bit there.
Well, it seems to me that that's a worthwhile thing to worry about, because what we're talking about is, a historic question: what knowledge is of most worth? Which is what Herbert Spencer asked in the late 19th century. It's the same kind of question that educators, parents, policymakers, and researchers are asking now. That's never put as directly as I just put it, because the reason that you give is that the liberal arts historically have been the kind of answer to that question: what knowledge is of most worth? But the liberal arts have been seriously questioned. In exchange for that kind of those disciplines and those bodies of knowledge that are most useful, that will get you a better paying job, and so on like that. And this tension between the utilitarian and the humanitarian has been within public schools, within universities for centuries. Yeah.
What's the role of the way in which things get sold to schools? Is this equation impacted by the fact that we market to schools? That if you go to an educational technology show, that it is a show, there's a lot of money being spent to convince people to buy, and if it is impacted by that, is there a reasonable alternative in our capitalist system? Is there a way to sell technology or implement technologies in schools that would be more balanced? Well,
I have two quick responses, Steve. One is that the alternative is to be skeptical. We live in a consumer-driven society where claims are made all the time. The cultivation of skepticism is absolutely essential, and nowadays more and more people are appropriately asking the kinds of questions that were not asked a decade ago, 15 years ago, about machine technologies. So that, to me, is the alternative. My other response is that in this kind of market-driven society, that the role of vendors, the role of major corporations like IBM, Apple, and so on, those play a very large part in the selling of technology to schools, to universities, primarily because both the elite groups in our society and the vendors' interests merge. Elite groups believe that, by elite groups, I mean elites in economic elites, civic elites, the kind of elite groups that we have in this kind of society that has a lot of different social classes in it. Those elite groups and those corporations, their interests merge because it is the profound assumption that unless schools produce skilled graduates, then the U.S.'s share of the global market will continue to decline. This is that assumption became explicit in the late 70s and the early 80s with the Nation at Risk report, and continues to be dominant today. So vendors of technology play a crucial role in the selling of machines to public schools and universities. And that's where the skepticism must come in.
So your answer would be that we need to be skeptical or thoughtful in evaluating those claims.
Correct. And to raise questions about them.
Do you see any of the new web technologies, like blogging or wikis, being transformative enough that they will lead toward more adoption or interest in adoption of computers in the classroom by the teachers?
I'm not sure. I've looked at education blogs, and there is a whole directory of teacher blogs and other educator blogs, and I think that's useful. Teachers have historically been underrepresented in writing and voicing their points of view, and so blogging, I think, is helpful, and I follow some of those teacher blogs. As to the Wikipedia and that kind of thing, I think, the cherished hope of the internet was the impulse toward democracy, and I like those kinds of ideas. But right now, it might be a lack of imagination, or it might be the time of day. I can't see those somehow making the leap to schools. But I like what I do see, and I think they're important. But if you consider one of the major issues, the still substantial lack of integration of machine technologies into daily teaching, then I'm not quite sure those developments are going to help that.
Well, one of the things that I meant to steer toward, but probably didn't do a good job of, is that I by virtue of where I sit in the school technology arena, I get to talk to people who are really excited about the impact on students that having student blogs provides. That the inherent peer review process, the learning to communicate through writing, the getting of feedback, not just necessarily from classmates, but oftentimes from other schools or other classes, or even in some cases people outside of the school environment, that it's producing an excitement about writing and communicating that for some teachers has really felt to them like it's been transformative. And I think it's producing a little bit of a grassroots movement. And part of what I like about it is that it only requires a web browser.
Right.
So from the standpoint of technology, it's a very simple, low-cost solution. I mean, pretty much any existing computer equipment can be used to do it. And so, I'm kind of hoping that will be an opportunity for there to be a use of the technology that really does excite people and allows it to be integrated without having to buy new equipment.
I think that, what you say is reasonable. I've always been, what's the best word? I've always been admiring of that small percentage of teachers that I run across the country that are using the kind of advanced technologies to involve their students, and you mentioned one of those with student blogs, and to improve writing and other aspects. And there are those kinds of teachers, and it's wonderful when I read those kinds of stories in the newspaper or on the web. It's great, and that does occur. The larger question for me is that if it occurs in a small minority of classrooms, can it occur in most classrooms, and then should it occur in most classrooms? Because teaching is so individualistic, and teaching is so context dependent, given the socioeconomic status of kids, given the ethnicity, the race, the gender, all of those kinds of issues. So what you say, makes a lot of sense, and it does sound promising. Most of those things come from a small minority of teachers, and trying to generalize from that, I have found it to be very difficult.
And those are points that are well taken. I'll be interested in sort of watching that, because one of the things that I like about that particular movement is it's very much sort of teacher-to-teacher mentoring.
Yes.
And it's not driven by a commercial interest or marketing, but it's sort of an opportunity to adopt if you want, because it's helpful. And it seems like maybe those are some of the elements that would actually allow for the creative use of computing that came as adoption rather than being pressed on someone.
No, I would agree with you. I've always been impressed with the Apple Classroom of Tomorrow studies that were done over a 12-year period from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s. The ACOT studies showed that teachers learn best when they are working with other teachers and learning from other teachers, and that professional development is integral to any kind of changes that people seek in teaching practices. And and the ACOT studies also showed that you don't need one-to-one. You can have a cluster of computers in a classroom, 5 to 6, that can do the job. You don't need the one-to-one. And those studies I have found to be most helpful in making sense of a lot of the claims that are made today. But that most important, that if you really want teachers to integrate the uses of the machine technologies into their daily practices, then you really have to involve teachers from the very beginning of the formation of a policy on technology, and have them involved at every step of the way, helping to make those decisions, including the purchase of the computers, the software, and the deployment of them. Steve, we ought to be almost finished now, aren't we?
We are very close.
Okay.
Can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
Have you seen that done somewhere that you feel that you could point out that where you feel that a school or a district has involved the teachers early on, and that you feel like the program has been successful?
Well, yes. Yes and no. In Oversold and Underused, I had a section about what I considered a very promising federally funded project in Berkeley, California. It was a 5-year project, and it's in I think the last chapter of my book. And it talked about how teachers became the mentors and became in effect, the evangelists for technology in each of their schools, and worked very closely with teachers. And there was a spread over the 5-year period. Unfortunately, those federal funds dried up, and successive superintendents basically dismantled those programs. Where I have seen it work best has been in a few districts that saw technology as a learning tool, and what they did was to institute a series of district-wide reforms. I'm thinking of Union City, New Jersey, of low-income, largely minority district, where they instituted a number of curriculum reforms, organizational reforms, and then brought in the technology after the first 3 to 4 or 5 years, after a lot of preparation of teachers and teacher involvement. And what happened was that the test scores began to rise and everything. Unfortunately, a lot of people concluded that it was the computers that caused the rise in student achievement, when it was actually a series of reforms that had taken place involving teachers, involving curriculum, involving the organization over a 5 to 7 year period that comprehensively changed what went on in that district from the mid-'80s to the '90s. And yet technology was then boosted as the reason why, when it really wasn't. So there are some examples of what I consider smart superintendents and school boards who see technology as a tool, and that teachers have to be on board very early on. And those districts deserve a nice pat on the back, and that's the way that I think it should go.
Good. Larry, I really appreciate the time.
Sure,
and
Steve.
I appreciate the message and the thoughtful way in which you deliver it, and the balance to it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. For those who are listening, next week we'll be talking about Open Office, the open source office program, and we'll look forward to next week.